Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to go over Matthew chapter 5 in 5 minutes. Now, it's important to know a little bit about the context of this chapter. Matthew 5, 6, and 7 are all part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, if you've ever heard of that. So now let's work through the usual questions that we talk about. When did the events of chapter 5 take place? Well, this is during Jesus' ministries going around preaching, and this would have been between 26 and 31 AD. Now, we don't have a lot of main characters in this chapter because it's really just the record of a sermon. So Jesus is obviously the main character. He's up on a mountain, he's teaching. He is the Messiah, the one who's come to save the world. And then we have his disciples and perhaps some other people who are listening to Jesus. And Jesus' disciples were the people that heeded his words and obeyed them. Now, where did the events of chapter 5 take place? We don't know specifically what mountain Jesus was on. The Bible just doesn't tell us. There is a tradition that the Sermon on the Mount was delivered on a place that has now come to be known as the Mount of the Beatitudes. And I marked the general location on the map in the handout to the southwest of Capernaum. And just to mention, if you want this handout, you can download it on our website, link down in the description. Now, we can work through an outline of the book. As I already mentioned, chapters 5, 6, and 7 are all record of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount begins with maybe the most famous section of the whole thing, and that is the Beatitudes in verses 1 through 12. So Jesus goes up onto a mountain and he begins teaching, and he started by talking about people who would be blessed by the kingdom of God. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn. Blessed are the meek, those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart, the peacemakers, the persecuted, the reviled, and those who are falsely slandered by others." In the second section, verses 13 through 16, Jesus talked about how his disciples were supposed to have an impact and an influence on the world. So he compared his disciples to two things, salt and light. Now, salt, when you put it on food, it's supposed to influence the taste in a positive way. And light, take a candle, for example. When you light a candle, it's supposed to shine light throughout the dark spaces. And so in a similar way, Christians are to have a positive influence on the world around them. They are to be a light in the darkness of a sinful world. Now, section 3, verses 17 through 20, Jesus is talking about his relationship to the old Jewish religious system, often called the Law of Moses. Jesus came to the earth to fulfill the promises that were made by God in the Old Testament. He had not come to undermine the Law of Moses, and many people were accusing him of that. So the Law of Moses and the work of Jesus, they were completely in unison. They were all part of God's unified plan and the story that he was telling to bring salvation to all people. And then really the second half of this chapter, verses 21 through 48, I lumped it into one big category because it's kind of hard to break down. And I just titled it, Jesus Teaches on Various Topics. So Jesus talked about the danger of anger. He spoke about reconciling relationships with people who have offended you or have sinned against you, avoiding lust and guarding your heart against evil intentions. He talked about restrictions on divorce, when it was permissible, when it wasn't permissible. He told his disciples not to take oaths, but to keep their word. And then finally, he taught them to be kind to their enemies and not to return evil actions for evil actions. And in doing that, they would be sons of their Father in heaven. So how does this chapter kind of fit into God's big story that he's telling all throughout the Bible? Well, we touched on this a little bit, but God's original laws, as he gave them to the Jewish people and delivered them through Moses and the prophets, they had served their purpose, and they had accomplished exactly what God had intended for them to accomplish. But the time had come for something new. And God had sent Jesus to the earth to communicate that new covenant or new testament. The Sermon on the Mount and other teaching sessions of Jesus, they were going to be used by him to communicate the way that God wanted his followers to progress into the future. So Jesus is coming to change things up, but in a way that is consistent with all that God has said before. Now finally, our application section. There's so many applications from this chapter, I just had to pick out one. I think this is a good one, maybe one that isn't brought to the attention of Christians as much as some of the others. So in verse 37, Jesus taught, "Let what you say simply be Yes or no? Jesus didn't want his disciples going to extremes like taking oaths and swearing for people to consider them trustworthy. And that command is rather easy to understand and to comprehend, but it isn't always practiced as well as it should be. We, even as Christians, we're sometimes quick to go back on the commitments that we make. We come up with excuses to get out of things that we agreed to do. I do it too. I'm sure that you've done it in the past. We overschedule ourselves, and then we have to go break our promises or go back on our word. And all these things have kind of become just normal in our society. Giving your word to somebody isn't what it used to be. But what if Christians were known as people who never broke their word? Could have a very positive impact on the world that we live in the way that other people view disciples.